1993 really was Sonic's year, man. If you're too young to remember, or more likely weren't even born yet, holy crap, I'm old, I really can't even begin to adequately describe how big a deal Sonic was back then. Before the release of Sonic 1, Nintendo were the clear leaders in console video games, occupying a staggering 90% of the American market. But by the beginning of 1993, that percent had dropped to a mere 35. SEGA of America had gained 60% of the market, marking the first time since the release of the NES that Nintendo wasn't at the top of the industry. And it was the release of Sonic that had gotten that ball rolling. Ha! Ball rolling, get it? I slay me. And after the franchise had seen two successful console video games, SEGA of America went full steam with the Blue Blur. They greenlit not one, but two simultaneous TV cartoons starring the character. One was dark and dramatic, and the other was a hilarious comedy about chili dogs, and the same guy played Sonic in both shows. Isn't that wild? The same guy playing two different versions of the same guy? They licensed out a comic book with Archie Comics, which would not only thrive throughout the Dark Age of Sonic and the Dark Age of Comics, but would also go on to be the longest-running comic book based on a video game, at 290 monthly issues over a span of 23 years, as well as a half-dozen spin-off comics and a crossover with Mega Man. Not to mention, there was a crap ton of Sonic toys and merchandise, and Sonic even got a float in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, the first video game character in history to have the honor. Just maybe don't look into what happened to the float that year. How embarrassing, the one time Sonic failed to pass a lamppost. And even with all that going on, SEGA had enough time left over to make sure Sonic was still making regular video game appearances. They clearly didn't want to risk the possibility of Sonic being just a fad, and wanted to capitalize on the franchise's instant popularity on all possible fronts. 1993 saw the release of a whopping 4 Sonic the Hedgehog video games across 3 consoles. Well, I guess 3.5 games really, but let's put a pin in that for now. The first of these games, and also the only one that could really be considered a mainline title, was Sonic CD, released for the Sega Mega CD in September 1993. The Mega CD, called simply the Sega CD in North America, was a CD-ROM add-on for the Genesis released in December 1991, which allowed the console to produce more power and CD-quality audio and music. Sonic CD was meant to be the console's first flagship title, as the peripheral had failed to sell substantial numbers in its first year and a half on the market. While Sonic teams Yuji Naka and Hirokazu Yasuhara had departed Sega of Japan to join Sega Technical Institute in the States, Sonic's creator, Naoto Oshima, had stayed behind in Japan, and he was chosen to lead the team that would develop Sonic CD. Originally conceived as simply a souped-up Sega CD version of Sonic 1, Sega higher-ups considered the title more of a B project when compared to Sonic 2, and it's perhaps because of this that the project would graduate into an original game instead. Oshima reportedly received very little executive oversight for the game, and thus was essentially allowed to just make whatever he wanted. And after a long-distance phone call with his old colleague Yuji Naka, Oshima's team would end up using a lot of the ideas for Sonic 2 in their game as well, most notably the scrapped time travel concept, which would not only be featured prominently in this game, but would be its core driving gameplay mechanic. The plot of Sonic CD sees Sonic traveling to visit Little Planet, a mysterious extra-dimensional planetoid that appears over the skies of Neverlake for 1 month of the year. Aside from its perceived beauty, Little Planet is also said to be a place where time is not linear, with sceneries and environments often completely changing in the blink of an eye. Upon his arrival at Neverlake, however, Sonic is shocked to find Little Planet completely covered in machinery and chained to a nearby mountain, keeping it bound to this location. This was no doubt the work of Dr. Eggman, who was hoping to harness the power of Little Planet's time stones to keep it perpetually under his own rule. While Sonic tries to stop Eggman's schemes yet again, he must also rescue the young Amy Rose, who has been abducted by Dr. Eggman's latest and most deadly robotic creation, Metal Sonic. So right off the bat, we have the addition of 2 new characters. First up is Amy Rose, a young girl and a fan of Sonic, who travels to Neverlake after a tarot card reading predicts a meeting with her hero there. Amy was inspired by a character of the same name from the 1992 Sonic manga published by Shogakukan. The team was inspired to include a character who could act as the mini to Sonic's Mickey, but with a twist. While Amy is absolutely infatuated with Sonic, Sonic really shows no interest in her at all. Sonic lives for adventure and is always on the move, and though he's a good dude who always helps those in need, he's simply not interested in romance. Amy's desire for a relationship intentionally clashes with Sonic's impulsive and free-spirited nature, creating a somewhat unexpected dynamic between the two. It's a cool little subversion of a cartoon trope that had been around for decades at that point. What happens when you give a love interest to a character not interested in love? It also retroactively kind of becomes a commentary on parasocial relationships as well. Like, no, your favorite YouTuber is not actually your friend. Except me, of course. I'm your friend. Like and subscribe. Amy would continue to appear throughout the franchise, albeit somewhat sparingly and exclusively in spin-offs, up until being made a core character in the Sonic Adventure games, and she's been a mainstay in the cast ever since. In terms of design, unfortunately, I'm really not a fan of Amy's classic look. Overall, she's really just a pink Sonic, which, okay. And what is going on with her outfit? The actual clothes are fine, they fit the vibe of a young girl in a whimsical cartoon world, but there's just way too many clashing colors going on here. She's got a red headband, lime green shirt, orange skirt, and purple shoes. Holy hell. Look, pick any two, maybe three of those colors, and you might have something, but as it is now, this is just way too much. Her reintroduction in Sonic Adventure would come with a complete makeover for her, and that's really a much better look if you ask me. That DLC costume for her in Sonic Superstars feels like it was made specifically to please me. Oh, and the American manual called her Princess Sally to tie the game in with the Archie comics and Saturday morning cartoon. And that's silly. From a marketing standpoint, I get it from the angle of, like, brand continuity or whatever, and I know Sally was actually pink for a bit, but these are blatantly not the same character to anyone with functioning eyes. The other new character, or machine, would of course be Metal Sonic, possibly Dr. Eggman's greatest creation. Naota Oshima wanted to introduce a character who could act as Sonic's, quote, greatest and eternal rival. And Metal Sonic is just that. Finally, Eggman created a machine that represents his own ideal vision of the Blue Blur, completely mechanized and totally subservient to him. And, most importantly, successfully equaling Sonic in his most notable trait, speed. And how did he do it? Well, by basically just building a tiny jet plane. Seriously, look at Metal. His torso is just a jet turbine. And that is not only a clever bit of writing and lore, but also just ingenious character design. The instruction manual even lists off specs for Metal Sonic like his CPU, engine output, and torque. And even though it's all clearly fanciful and exaggerated, it's an extra mile the developers didn't have to take, all in service of making the character feel that much more realized. His design is sleek and slender, but sharp and intimidating, with lots of harsh corners and straight lines to contrast with Sonic's curved and round body shapes. He doesn't run, but instead hovers above the ground. His nose and fingers are sharp cones of steel. His eyes are black voids of LCD pixels with harsh red rings for pupils, and he lacks any sort of visible mouth. Metal Sonic isn't here to talk, he's here to get shit done. This design has remained virtually unchanged throughout the decades, even as the rest of the cast received revisions to their looks a handful of times. Metal Sonic is a design that just nailed it on the first try. It's damn brilliant. Sonic would gain other rivals throughout the years, and even the idea of a robotic Sonic doppelganger is one that's been used multiple times, both before and after this game. In fact, all 4 classic mainline Sonic titles feature some sort of robotic Sonic double, but this is the one to stand the test of time and become the de facto version. This is the Metal Sonic. Sonic's moveset in Sonic CD is built very much like the previous 2 games, and Sonic's sprites are mostly reused from Sonic 1. He has the spin dash from Sonic 2, kind of. I think the phone call with Yuji Naka could only convey so much because this spin dash has none of the thrill or spectacle of Sonic 2's spin dash. It has to be fully charged or else nothing will happen, meaning it's a huge pace breaker as well. Moreover, Sonic was also given the Peel Out, a standing version of the spin dash that achieves a higher max speed and can be pulled out with less charge time. The Peel Out's downside, in theory, is that Sonic isn't rolling while using the move, meaning he's vulnerable to taking damage. But, like, there's nothing stopping you from just rolling into a ball once you get moving. So the Peel Out has essentially rendered the spin dash redundant. Looks really cool, though. Oh, and remember in my previous Sonic videos where I mentioned how tight the screen space can feel sometimes? Well, here, when you charge up the peel out or otherwise reach your top speed, the camera will actually pan forward so you can see more of the level ahead of you. And that extra split second of granted reaction time can really make all the difference sometimes. I'm astounded that no other 2D Sonic game has done this. In terms of structure, CD takes the basic gameplay loop from Sonic 1. High-speed side-scrolling action through open and intricate levels is the name of the game. But CD puts an interesting spin on things, no pun intended, by including a time travel mechanic. Throughout each stage are scattered various lampposts labeled either past or future. And once you pass one of those, maintaining your speed for around 5 seconds or so will carry Sonic to the designated point in time, the entire level changing around him. If your speed is interrupted, the process is cancelled and you have to locate another lamppost to try again. Standing in for the Chaos Emeralds this time are the 7 Time Stones, and collecting all of them is the only way to truly thwart Eggman. So if you want to, you can just play this game like Sonic 1, rushing to the end of each stage and collecting Time Stones if you want, defeating Eggman like usual. But to get the good ending, you'll need to secure a good future in each zone. Each level has 4 different versions you can travel between: the present, the past, and 2 possible futures. A good future, wherein Sonic has successfully stopped Eggman from taking over, or a bad future, where Eggman rules. Getting all the Time Stones retroactively achieves good futures on all stages and guarantees the better ending. But if you prefer, you can also individually travel to the past version of each level and locate the robot generators hidden there to achieve good futures as well. And it's because of all this that the level design in Sonic CD can get a bit eccentric. Levels have a lot of odd dead ends and side paths, and rings are often lodged into the scenery where they can't be collected. But this too ties towards that time travel technique, as those dead ends and rings will often be completely open and available if you find them in the past or future instead. And whether you choose to speed through each act or slow down and look for lampposts and generators, every level of the game is designed to accommodate either choice. There are various fast lanes to zip you across the landscapes, but each level is also completely backtrackable, so you can search for those generators. And I can't imagine this being an easy balancing act for the game designers, so kudos to them, truly. The major exception, though, is Wacky Workbench. Act 1 is designed around low-hanging pillars that you have to travel under, which is an interesting concept that subverts the usual high ground is the fastest level design of Sonic 1 and 2. The top paths here are all dead ends, and so sticking to the low path is the only way forward. But the floor is set up to launch you high up should you touch it. So the whole way you're dealing with these slow-moving platforms, and messing up even a single jump can slow down your run by potentially minutes. Act 2, thankfully, is a bit more traditional, but Wacky Workbench is still easily my least favorite level and a sole blemish on a string of levels that I think are all otherwise pretty good. And it's in the levels themselves where you can really start to see the remnants of the game's original plan to be a remake of Sonic 1. Almost all the level themes are recycled from that game. Seriously, think about it. Palm Tree Panic is Green Hill, Collision Chaos is Spring Yard, Tidal Tempest is Labyrinth, Stardust Speedway is Starlight, and Metallic Madness is Scrap Brain. If the numbering sequence in the level select screen is any indication, there was a level 2 that was cut at some point. I'm betting that would have been the Marble Zone stand-in, if this deleted scene from the ending is to be believed. But there are 2 levels in Sonic CD that could be considered completely original. One is Wacky Workbench, which is just another factory level, sure, but that bouncing floor gimmick hasn't been seen before. And the other is Quartz Quadrant, which is probably my favorite of the bunch. Just so cool visually, and the layout flows really well. In fact, ignoring Wacky Workbench, I don't think there's a single level here I dislike. You know there's some talent involved when even the underwater level doesn't suck. And this is the first Sonic game where the bosses really stick out to me in terms of game design. Sonic CD borrows from the Game Gear games in that Act 3 of each zone is a dedicated boss level, with just a short stretch of running and jumping before getting to Eggman. Each boss act holds at least 100 rings and an extra life box, as well as one of each type of power-up, and doesn't that just make you want to try and track them all down? But the bosses themselves are interesting in that most of them require very few actual hits to defeat. I think the most is around 4 or so. No, they're more about memorizing a certain pattern or gimmick and striking when the boss is vulnerable. The first boss is basically a freebie, while the second takes place on a full-fledged pinball table, with the goal of simply reaching Eggman at the top while breaking through barricades and evading falling bombs. My favorite example is Quartz Quadrant, where you don't actually need to hit Eggman at all, instead just dodge bombs while you run on this conveyor belt, gradually grinding down the bottom of the machine Eggman's standing in until he's forced to abandon ship. And of course, there's the race with Metal Sonic in Stardust Speedway. What a freaking great concept for a Sonic boss. Running and jumping through an obstacle course full of hazards while also avoiding attacks from Metal Sonic and making sure not to fall behind enough for Eggman's Death Beam to catch up. Sonic was built for stuff like this, and this boss is always exciting and just challenging enough to be satisfying. If there is one major criticism I could levy at the gameplay of Sonic CD though, it would be that the game doesn't offer the player enough incentive to travel into the future. In fact, it often feels like a punishment, since the robot generator you need to destroy in each stage is located only in the past. In theory, the good futures are smoother to run through and less obstructed by hazards, and since you've already destroyed the robot generator just to get there, most of the enemies will be gone as well. But if I've already gone to the trouble of traveling to the past and scouring the level for the generator, it seems like a big waste of time to then find a future post to travel to the present, then find another future post, and then travel to the future again, just to make my trip through the last, third of the act slightly easier. I don't think I've ever once gone out of my way to travel to the future in this game. The boss acts always take place in one of the two futures, whichever one you've earned for that zone, but besides that, I've never seen the future versions of these zones outside of using level select. Being made for the SEGA CD came with a lot of advantages and quirks when compared to the standard Genesis titles. For one thing, Sonic CD is the first Sonic game to have a save feature, thanks to the built-in RAM of the SEGA CD. The game won't remember which exact act you're on, nor what your score was, but it will keep track of good futures and time stones, and you can pick up from the beginning of the last zone you were on. This save feature also means that the game could include bonus modes and unlockables, such as a music player and cutscene viewer. And would you believe this is the only classic Sonic game to have a time attack mode? That's crazy, right? Two of the big selling points for CD-based games of the time was obviously the ability for CD-quality audio and music, but also for full-motion video playback. As such, Sonic CD features full opening and ending sequences by Toei Animation, or more specifically Studio Junyo, albeit the versions in the final game have a lot of bit compression to be able to fit it all in there. Really though, doesn't that just give them a certain bit of charm in its own way? The special stages here were also a great showcase of the SEGA CD's capabilities. Entering the stages follows the Sonic 1 method of carrying 50 rings to the end of the stage, but the stages themselves are completely new and a technical wonder for their time. You control Sonic in a 3D environment as he tries to defeat a handful of UFOs before time runs out, and touching any body of water will subtract from your remaining time as well. These things are a real visual tour de force, and they don't feel bad to play either. Unfortunately, the hitboxes on the UFOs can be a bit misleading. The actual contact point is deceptively small compared to the sprites you're being shown, and Sonic's steering is very rigid, making 180-degree turns basically impossible. But as far as classic-era special stages go, Sonic CDs are my favorite. The game's soundtracks are also really strong thanks to the CD format. And yes, that was a plural I just used, because Sonic CD actually features region-specific music. The original Japanese soundtrack, which was carried over into the European version, was largely made up of Eurobeat-inspired electronic dance music, but Sega of America felt this choice of genre was becoming too trendy and overdone, and so decided to replace the majority of the game's music. Composer Spencer Nilsson was hired to rescore the game's soundtrack, and collaborating with female vocal trio Pastiche, he created a score that was much more surreal, ambient, and dreamlike. And they created a new main theme for the game titled Sonic Boom. Being on a CD, the music didn't need to be generated by the console itself, like it would be on the Genesis, so the act of replacing them all was as simple as just swapping out the game's music files. They weren't able to replace every song, though. The Japanese soundtrack was structured so that each stage's 4 time periods used different arrangements of the same composition, with the future versions sounding more advanced and the past versions sounding more primitive. They even got clever with this by having the past tracks not use CD audio at all, but instead use the built-in music generator, like a standard Genesis game would. Ergo, it was playing music of the past using an outdated method, get it? But because of this, the US version couldn't replace those past versions of the songs, at least not without a lot of time and effort, since those pieces were baked into the game itself, so they had to leave them be. As for which I prefer, well, as much as it sounds like a cop-out, I think they're both really good. They're just so different it doesn't even feel right to compare them. Probably my favorite instance of this juxtaposition is listening to the tracks for Metallic Madness. Couldn't be further off from one another, and it's kind of hilarious, honestly. I usually play with the Japanese music just because I enjoy the more high energy and irreverent feel it gives off, but the Nielsen score's dreamlike quality meshes really well with the game's overall vibe, which is often filled with a lot of surreal imagery itself. And let's be honest, Sonic Boom is a way better song than whatever the fuck the Japanese themes were supposed to be.
What do you mean? Give me taste, going home. Side zone, check out it. Live alone, leather legs, get in place. What do you get? Say, back it. Zoom room, cosmic zoom. That's up, James.
Of course, there is at least one major downside when dealing with CD-ROMs: load times. This most obviously results in every level being preceded by several seconds of black nothing, but that's not all. Any CD-based music takes a second to start up, so each level starts in silence for a bit, and the music also can't loop. Every track fades out when it reaches the end and has to play from the beginning whenever it's interrupted. I never once got to hear the end of the level clear jingle because it always loaded too late.
Yes!
And this can even affect gameplay. The jingles for invincibility and speed-ups are normally an indicator for the player to determine how long the effect will still be active, but that doesn't really work if the music doesn't start right away. Even beyond the music, though, the load times did also affect how the game was actually designed and programmed. Naoto Oshima's original vision for time travel was that the level would seamlessly change around Sonic in the blink of an eye, inspired by the film Back to the Future, but his team had to let him know that this wouldn't be possible on a CD. So the final game unfortunately has to buffer any instance of time travel with an animation and a loading screen. Oshima has been quoted saying that had Yuji Naka been working on the game, he would have been able to find a way to fix this. And honestly, it's kinda sweet that he showed that kind of faith in his colleague, even if Yuji Naka is a petty asshole. Aesthetically, Sonic CD is especially unique even among the classic Sonic titles, and it's one of my favorites in the franchise graphically. When I think of what classic Sonic art design should look like, Sonic CD is what comes to mind. The game also has a lot of neat little flourishes that just add that extra bit of character to the whole thing. Defeating enemies doesn't release trapped animals, but instead plants a flower in their wake, and so when you destroy that robot generator, the level turns into an idyllic garden. But if you do miss the little critters, you can find and destroy the Metal Sonic holograms hiding in the past of each act. Doing so does nothing in the long run, but it brings all the local wildlife out of hiding to really liven up the scenery. You'll sometimes see worn down or decrepit robots in the present and future, and these robots often move slower and even behave more erratically, and it's cool to see the game designers really embracing the game's central concept like this. Metallic Madness Act 2 has this set piece with a shrinking laser, and sure, there's not much point to it, but goddammit if it ain't charming. Sonic has this unique jumping sprite if you go down this ramp in Palm Tree Panic, that's neat. And Sonic CD even expands on the character's idle animation. If the player for whatever reason doesn't touch the controller for 3 full minutes, Sonic will get fed up and jump off the screen, granting a game over. This is even accompanied by the first instance of the character speaking a voiced line of dialogue.
I'm out of here!
And honestly, it's just not a Sonic game to me if Sonic isn't at least a little bit of a dick. Sonic CD would end up selling over 1.5 million copies, which made it the highest-selling SEGA CD game. And while that might sound impressive to some, it wouldn't be enough to make the console a success. For comparison, the highest-selling Genesis game sold 15 million units, and the best-selling Super Nintendo game sold 20 million. If your console's best-selling game isn't even breaking 2 mil, the writing on the wall is pretty clear. Due to this, Sonic CD would become somewhat elusive and obscure for quite a few years. Of the classic mainline Sonic titles, it's seen the fewest number of re-releases, likely due to the complicated nature of porting or emulating SEGA CD games in general. It received a Windows 95 port in 1996, which featured minor visual and performance upgrades, and this was actually the version I owned as a kid. This PC version would then be included in Sonic Gems Collection in 2005, the first ever console re-release of the game in 12 years. The game was later rebuilt from the ground up by Christian Whitehead and his team for mobile phones, Xbox Live, and PSN in 2011, and most recently was included in Sonic Origins in 2022. That's a mere 3 re-releases since 1993. Absolutely paltry compared to Sonic 1 and 2 being ported to every console, handheld, phone, and kitchen appliance dozens of times over the last 30 years. While the game has always done fairly well with critics, Sonic CD's reception among fans has seemed to shift over time. Back in the days where the game simply wasn't easily available to most people, it held this certain reputation as something of a white whale, a hidden gem that was tragically lost to history. This gave the game a certain sense of mystique, of intrigue. It wasn't uncommon to hear talk of the best Sonic game ever made being stuck on a console nobody owned. But with the release of Gems Collection, and especially the Whitehead port, the game was finally available to a widespread mainstream audience. And with the loss of that obscurity it always held, came a sudden wave of criticism from people who were playing it for the first time after years of older fans hyping it up. Safe to say, modern critical discourse around Sonic CD is much more mixed these days. Many fans don't seem to be too fond of the game's more exploratory gameplay or its sometimes erratic stage design. Somehow, the time travel mechanic sees criticism on two opposite fronts. Some see it as an intrusive pace breaker, while others complain that it's completely pointless and easily ignored. So which is it? Does it get in the way or is it not present enough? Because it can't be both. As for me, well, this is gonna sound mean, but I think most of the people complaining about Sonic CD are just kinda bad at the game. Sonic CD, to me, is the only classic Sonic game to offer so many different valid ways to play and multiple methods to accomplish your goals. Like I said earlier, if you want to just play the game like Sonic 1, you absolutely can. But really delving into the time travel mechanic, learning how it works, and getting really good at it is one of the most satisfying experiences in this franchise. As much as I love fan favorite Sonic 3, that game's levels are much more linear and driven by spectacle and cinematic set pieces, which makes initial playthroughs exciting, but turns repeat plays into kind of a drag. Sonic CD, though, is a game you can play over and over and still find something new. To collect footage, I played the game 4 times, and none of those runs looked even remotely the same. And I've played it probably close to 100 times over the years and have never once gotten tired of it. Each time I play, I find myself asking, do I want to get all the generators this time? The time stones? Both? Neither? Do I want to hunt down all the metal Sonic holograms just to see all the animals frolicking? Should I see if I can actually travel to the good future of every zone, or should I just race to the finish? There's real, actual depth here, and it's just really interesting to have a side-scrolling 2D platformer that gives me honest-to-God options for how I want to play. If you've never played the game, give it a try and play around for a bit. I think you'll find a lot here to like. And if you've already played Sonic CD and maybe didn't like it so much, I urge you to give it another go. Set aside your preconceptions of what a classic Sonic game should be, and really try to play the game on its terms instead of your terms. Once you engage with the game's systems and realize how they all mesh together, I think you'll be surprised to find yourself itching to try it again and again. About a month after the release of Sonic CD, we got Sonic Chaos, the third entry in the adjacent Game Gear side series of Sonic titles. SEGA was keeping diligent about having a new portable Sonic game each year to accompany that year's big console title, and developer Aspect was again hired for the job here. As this game was the follow-up to the Game Gear Sonic 2, it went under the working title of Sonic 3, but this was changed to avoid being confused with the actual Sonic 3, which was still in development and wouldn't be out until the following year. In Japan, it would go by the title Sonic and Tails, and I gotta say, I've never seen a game where both regional titles end up being completely ungoogleable, but here we are. Sonic Chaos plays identically to the previous Game Gear titles, Sonic 2 specifically, but with the major addition of Tails as a playable character. The spin dash makes its portable debut, and Sonic also has a tweaked version of the peel-out called the strike dash, which works similarly but grants Sonic invincibility for a split second upon takeoff. Tails' flight ability was also integrated into the gameplay, allowing Tails to gain unrestricted height for a few seconds, and this was the first time Tails' flight was an actual playable mechanic. There's also a new power-up exclusive to Sonic, the Rocket Shoes, which propel him through the air at high speed for a few seconds, often allowing you to zip across large sections of level. Special stages are back after being absent from the handheld Sonic 2, but they are notably only accessible with Sonic. Upon collecting 100 rings in any act, you'll be transported to the special stage. And the stages don't follow any single set formula. Instead, they each offer their own unique puzzle or gimmick to overcome, tasking you with finding and retrieving the Chaos Emerald within a certain time limit. One just simply gives you a pair of rocket shoes, tells you to go nuts to find the emerald at the end. One is akin to a standard level act, and you have to run and platform your way to the end of the stage without falling into any of the pits along the way. Another has you bouncing onto higher and higher platforms as you climb your way to the emerald at the top. There are 5 special stages in total, with the 6th and final emerald being granted upon defeating Eggman in the game's final zone. Accessing a special stage also lets you skip the remainder of the current act regardless of whether you retrieve the emerald or not, so in a way they can even be used to skip levels. As for the zones themselves, Sonic Chaos is probably the easiest Sonic game I've ever played. Levels were made much shorter in this one, and while they tried to make up for this by providing denser level layouts with more alternate and interconnecting pathways, it wasn't uncommon for my first blind run through an act to be over in around 30 seconds. The special stages requiring 100 rings to enter meant every act had to be absolutely chock full of them. Seeing groups of 4 or 5 ring boxes lined up in a row was a regular occurrence. Boss acts were also made easier simply because they actually provide rings this time. If you're trying to get all the emeralds, the game can get a bit tricky, since that does require at least some memorization of level layouts and ring locations, but otherwise, the game is a breeze. You could knock this one out in an afternoon. With Sega so determined to see a Sonic game released on every possible platform, Sonic CD and Sonic Chaos wouldn't be enough. They needed another Genesis Sonic game too. Following the success of Sonic 2, the folks at Sega Technical Institute had pitched a spin-off pinball title, inspired by that game's very own Casino Night Zone. Yuji Naka initially shot the idea down, preferring that the team focus on developing Sonic 3 instead, but when Sonic 3 ended up being pushed back to the following year, Naka agreed to let the pinball game be made in order to fill the gap left behind. Sonic Spinball was developed entirely by American STI members, making it the first Sonic title to be 100% born and bred USA, baby! You can really see this in the game's visual design, which is a lot more grungy and grimy, fitting right in with the style of much of American early 90s pop culture. Sonic's design here also clearly leans far closer to the American-made Greg Martin box arts than it does the Japanese Naoto Oshima designs. And characters from the American cartoons even appear in the bonus stages. The music was composed by Howard Drawson, STI's first in-house music composer, and it's all fine. None of the tracks really stick out in my memory, other than the options menu music being a bit of a meme simply due to how grating the instrumentation is. Early on, Drawson had reportedly used the Sonic 2 title theme for this game's title screen as well, but when one of the Japanese staff saw the finished game, they remarked, "How did you get permission to use that?" To which Drawson replied, what? Yeah, Sega doesn't actually own the rights to any of the music for Sonic 1 or 2. Masato Nakamura and his band do. Drawson had no idea, and the game even had early carts produced with Nakamura's music before being pulled and changed last minute, so that's fun. In terms of gameplay, Sonic Spinball is exactly as advertised. It's pinball with Sonic. Now, as you listen to me talk about this game and watch the footage being played, let me just say, I'm bad at pinball. I can say it. I just am. That being said, this game doesn't really control quite the same as a real pinball table. Obviously, Sonic isn't just a pinball, he's a character, and so he can run, jump, and spin dash whenever he finds some ground flat enough to do so, and can also slightly influence his trajectory in midair by steering left or right. But the pinball physics in this game are all very lethargic and floaty, even after setting the speed to the highest setting. I could never quite get used to it. The game consists of 4 tables, each with the goal of interacting with certain spots on the board to open the way to the Chaos Emeralds, which will allow you to pinball your way up to the boss at the top. The list of objectives on each table can get pretty lengthy, and with only 3 balls granted to the player to gather all the emeralds and defeat the boss, it can take a lot of time, effort, and plain old luck to be able to pull it off. And, just to reiterate, I'm bad at pinball. The various boards will often feature gimmicks to interact with, sometimes even required to finish, with probably the most blatant example being these clucks in Lava Powerhouse. You have to use the steam jets at the bottom of this chamber to launch yourself straight above a cluck, which you then bounce off of to gain enough height to be sucked into this pipe here. And this part made me irrationally angry. You need to do this several times over the course of this table, and for the life of me, I could not find a way to pull it off consistently. Getting the timing and the angle just right without being flung off in a random direction seemed damn near random at times. I honestly don't have much to say about this game, because, again, I'm bad at pinball, but if you are a person who is not me, and who is, in fact, good at pinball, I don't know, maybe you'll have fun with this one? The 4th and final Sonic-related game to be released in 1993 was, in fact, not really a Sonic game at all. Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine was an Americanized reskin of a Japanese Tetris-style puzzle game called Puyo Puyo. The object of Puyo Puyo is to line up beans of matching colors in groups of 4 to clear out rows before your chamber gets filled. Pretty standard puzzle game stuff. But where Puyo Puyo has the edge over Tetris is that it's inherently designed to be competitive. 2 players, either human or CPU, compete to fill the other player's chamber while keeping their own empty. And by chaining together combos of beans in one fell swoop, you can send more of these black beans your opponent's way, which can only be removed by clearing out a bean directly adjacent to them. It builds on the quick thinking and score building of Tetris by also making the player think about how best to gain the advantage over their opponent and set up multiple combos. Puyo Puyo was a fairly popular game in Japan, and was probably Tetris's most competent rival within the puzzle gaming space. But American game companies weren't convinced the game's look and characters would be an easy sell for 1990s America. When SEGA of America brought the game over, they decided to reskin it using the Sonic brand. More specifically, Dr. Robotnik, and even more specifically, the version of Dr. Robotnik seen in The Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog cartoon. Every level is preceded by these short cutscenes where one of Robotnik's robots taunts you before challenging you to a bout of falling beans. It's just what made sense for the American market at the time. Nintendo of America even did something similar by changing the Super Nintendo version of Puyo Puyo into Kirby's Avalanche. But in terms of gameplay, it's still just Puyo Puyo, and that's great. I like Puyo Puyo. I'm not particularly great at Puyo Puyo, but I like it. Gee, Andrew, what games are you good at? Hey, shut up. Puzzle games in general can be super addictive, and I found myself easily getting hooked on this one. As you get to the later levels, though, the CPU just starts to blatantly cheat. As a human player, you have to juggle a lot of different things at once, like processing which combination of colors is falling, which direction to rotate it, and where best to place it to set up a combo. A CPU player doesn't have to worry about any of that. They just set each piece exactly where it needs to go 100% of the time, and the only way to throw a wrench into their plans is to set up a combo on them before they set one up on you. I have fun with the game, but I'd be lying if I said I ever have any actual idea what I'm doing. I'll be real, I'm pretty sure most of my wins were just pure luck. Despite being a Puyo Puyo game in disguise, Mean Bean Machine would be embraced by the larger Sonic franchise. Some examples being a Mean Bean-themed boss fight in Sonic Mania, and Sonic being an unlockable character in Puyo Puyo Tetris 2.
Try to keep up!
There was a Game Gear version released simultaneously with the Genesis version, with the obvious difference being the graphics and lack of cutscenes. But they're otherwise the same game. I beat both for the sake of collecting footage, because I don't value my own free time apparently, but there's really no reason for you to play more than one version.
Blue streak speeds by.
Safe to say, 1993 was one of Sonic's biggest years. Fans were eating good back then. It's really interesting looking back at a time when the Sonic franchise was not only active and thriving, but also experimenting with multiple media ventures and varied genres of games. About every half-decade or so, Sonic kinda dips out for a few years with only very sparing releases, so any year where we get this much Sonic content is one worth highlighting. Luckily for fans, 2023 was a pretty active year for the Blue Blur as well, and I can only hope we'll see plenty more like these to come.